Hello everybody. In today's video, we're going to be performing a timing belt and water pump service on my 2002 Acura TL Type S. This will pertain to a good number of V6 Honda and Acura engines. More specifically, my car has a J series engine, and this service needs to be performed roughly every 105,000 miles. This will be a somewhat lengthy video, so I would recommend just checking out the description where there will be timestamps to better navigate through the video, as well as there's going to be a bunch of other information, torque specs, part numbers, links to parts, and whatnot. Also, feel free to leave a comment. I'm pretty good at getting back to people. So why don't we get started? There isn't really a whole lot of inspecting to be done before we start this job. However, there is one part that we're going to check, and that would be the accessory belt tensioner located deep down in here. You'll see there's one line on the bottom of the tensioner itself, and then there's two lines above it. And what we're going to do is we're going to start the engine and ensure that the line on the tensioner continues to be between the two lines on the engine. If that line is not between the two lines, that means the tensioner is weak and it needs to be replaced. So let's check that now. Now we're going to purchase some parts. We're going to come to our favorite Acura parts website, and we're going to select our vehicle, 2002 Acura TL Type S. And we're going to start at the top here, come to body air conditioning, and then AC compressor. And we're going to add one compressor belt. Go back and select engine, and then we'll select the timing belt under camshaft there. And here's our timing belt, as well as the automatic tensioner, or adjuster it's called. Go back again, select engine, and then the power steering pump bracket. Here is our power steering belt. And then we'll go back. And then we'll select the water pump. Here's our water pump. Go back again. And now we're going to select some optional parts. You don't have to replace these. We're going to start with the oil pump strainer. And the manual recommends to replace the oil dipstick O-ring. I personally don't think you need to, but I'm just going to mention it because it does. So here's that. We'll go back. And for these next three parts, the pulleys, in my opinion, you don't need to replace these parts. They last a very long time. My car has 338,000 miles, and as you'll see, I would have reused all of them. But just in case yours have gone bad, here are the part numbers for those. We'll start with the engine and then alternator bracket. And here is the accessory belt tensioner slash pulley. It's a kind of a 2-in-1. We'll go back. And then one more time, we'll select engine and timing belt. And then here is the idler pulley, as well as the tensioner pulley. And then you really don't ever need to replace these parts unless they have gone bad. These are considered a lifetime part, and you shouldn't touch these unless they have clearly gone bad. Can't emphasize that enough. But in case you do need to replace these, here are the two camshaft oil seals. I'm not going to be showing how to replace those in this video. And then back one last time, select engine again, and the oil pump strainer again. And again, you don't replace this unless you have to, but here is the crankshaft oil seal. All right, now we're also going to be replacing the coolant since we're going to be replacing the water pump. We're going to need 2 gallons of this Type 2 Honda coolant. You can get for a little bit cheaper from the dealership, but in case you can't get from a dealer, here it is on Amazon, link in the description. We're also going to need a painter's pen or something to mark up the timing belt so we can line it properly. I just got mine from Meyer for like $2.50, simple enough. Now we're going to need some tools. First tool we're going to need is a crankshaft pulley holder tool. We're going to need this for when we torque that crank bolt to 181 foot-pounds. This tool can also be useful for a stubborn crank bolt that just doesn't want to come out. So you can purchase a nice one here on Amazon, link in the description, or you can rent one from AutoZone for free. Next tool we're going to need is a serpentine belt removal tool. There's pretty much zero clearance in that tight area down there when working on this project. So this is a very low profile tool that we're going to need. You can get for 20 bucks here, or again, you can rent it from AutoZone. Last tool, in my opinion, also not necessary. Maybe for some people if it's really stubborn, but this is called a weighted impact socket. And through the laws of physics, somehow, it basically adds 50% impact power to your impact wrench and makes easy work of removing those crank bolts. We're also going to need some 1/4-inch inner diameter vinyl tubing to drain the coolant out of the engine block. You can get this at almost any hardware store or Home Depot or Menards, such as right here, for pretty cheap, about $2.50 for 10 feet. So now I'm just going to do a quick side-by-side comparison of the old parts and the new parts, starting with the tensioner pulley. And it's got ever so slightly a little bit of play. Feels like there's still a little bit of lube in there. It's not grinding or anything. I would say this was a reusable part. As compared to the new one, obviously no play. And perfectly silent. You can feel that there's a little bit of lube in there, as there should be. But yeah, I'd say that's a reusable part. How about the Idler Pulley? I know you can't hear it, but there's also, again, just ever so slightly a minimal amount of play. You can hear this one's starting to dry out a little bit. But again, I would have reused it. And just for comparison's sake, the new one, no play. And you can just feel that there's more lube in there. Not dry like the other one. But yeah, I would say that would have been reusable. How about this guy? As we saw before in the beginning of the video, the tension was good. This one you can see in here that there is just absolutely no more lube left in this bearing. But there's no play. That's good. I don't know if that's of a concern or a potential cause of any noises, but as compared to the new one, it's good. Spins a little bit, doesn't make any noise at all. Yeah, if I were to replace any of these three, I would have replaced this one. But then again, yeah, I would say these parts do not need to be replaced, definitely before 300,000 miles. I would say they're all good for about 400,000. So before we begin, we're going to turn the power to the car on. And we're going to turn the heat up to the max, as well as the fans to the max. And that'll open the radiator and help us drain that coolant in a future step in the video. So the first step in doing this job is to see if we can remove that harmonic balancer bolt. If you can't remove that bolt, then you're not going to be able to do the rest of this job. So we're going to try and get to that first. It's located actually right in the back of this hole here, but we need to get access to the entire pulley. So we're going to remove this piece of plastic trim. It's held in by a couple clips here, and we'll go under the car. And a couple more clips just kind of along the way. We don't need to take them all the way out. We're just going to get it halfway out and kind of fold it back so it's out of the way. Here is that crankshaft pulley and the harmonic balancer bolt, and we're going to see if we can remove it or not. So I've got my mid-torque Milwaukee impact. Let's see if we can get it off. Wow. So in a lot of scenarios, that bolt does not come off that easy. For a lot of people I've seen, that is a very difficult bolt to remove. There are a couple other methods you can try to get it off. One might be involving this crankshaft pulley holder right here to help stabilize the pulley so that as you're trying to remove it or impact it off, that sometimes the pulley can kind of vibrate or spin and absorb a lot of the energy, and this can help stabilize the pulley, so removing it with your impact is more effective. They also sell bigger weighted impact sockets. More specifically, there's a Lyle socket that you can purchase that can also help to get it off. I'll post a link in the description for these tools. Another method in getting this bolt off, which I've seen has huge success rates, but also slightly dangerous, is what I like to call the bump method. And basically it would involve taking your ratchet, putting it on that bolt, and then what you would do is crank the engine. The pulley would spin clockwise while maintaining your ratchet position, and it would loosen the bolt that way. I'll post a link in the description of somebody else performing this. Now we know we can go on with the rest of the job, and so we're going to start by just removing the rest of the plastic trim in this wheel well, as well as this splash shield that goes all the way under the car, held in by a bunch of those clips. And you can remove those clips pretty easily with a flathead screwdriver. You can kind of get it in there, kind of get it started. And I've got this cool tool here. It's a specific clip removal tool. You just kind of wedge it in there and it comes right out. I'll post a link in the description for that. Next, we're going to remove the Serpentine belt, also known as the accessory belt. And you can see there's not a lot of clearance in there, maybe a ½ inch. So what we're going to do is remove it using this Serpentine belt tool. It's a very low profile, rented it from AutoZone, link in the description. And we're going to use our 14mm crowfoot attachment. All right, here we go. We're going to remove that Serpentine belt. We're going to pry it back, get our hand down in there, move the belt from under the tensioner itself. There we go. And the belt is loose. We can release the tension and remove the belt the rest of the way. Next, we're going to remove the power steering belt. But before we do that, we're just going to remove these two covers here to give us a little bit more working room. This top one's simply held in by 4 10mm bolts. And then you can take a screwdriver to loosen these two plastic tabs and pull it clean off. Next, we have to remove the side engine mount bracket. But before we do that, we have to come under the car, and we're going to take our jack. We're going to place a piece of wood on the jack and place it under the oil pan. And we're going to lift the engine up under that oil pan just about a ½ inch just to support the engine to make it easier to remove that bolt. So let's do that now. I'm going to ever so slightly lift the engine. And that should be good enough. Next, we're going to take a 17mm socket in our ratchet and remove this side bolt here. Try to be careful of these lines. You don't want to smash those. Here we go. We'll remove that the rest of the way. Then we'll remove this little green clip. Just push up on the tab and pull it up and out. There we go. Then we'll remove the two bolts on top of the bracket. One, two, and with some careful maneuvering, we're going to remove that bracket. It's kind of a tight squeeze, but you'll get it after a little bit. Oops. There we go. And we got it. Next, we're going to loosen the locking nuts on the power steering pump. First one is located down deep in there. And then there's a second one located on the back, right here. We're going to loosen both of those locking nuts, and then we're going to loosen the tensioner right here. And eventually you should get a good amount of slack in the power steering pump. And now we should be able to remove the belt. So let's remove that. Perfect. Now we're going to remove the dipstick tube, and it's held in by a screw way down in here. Right there. We'll remove that. After you remove that bolt that holds the dipstick tube in place, you can just then kind of wiggle it and pull it right up and out. There we go. And so that adjuster pulley for the Serpentine belt slash accessory belt tends to get in the way of quite a few bolts. So whether or not you plan on replacing it, I would still remove it just for the ease of access to some of these bolts. Simply held in by 3 of them, 1, 2, and 3. Next, we're gonna remove these timing belt covers, and they're held in by a series of these 10mm bolts all over the place. It's covered in here, covered back there, and one more below. We're just gonna work at removing those. Here's a close-up to give you a better idea of where all those bolts are located. You got 5 on this top one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And on the bottom there's a few more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When removing this back cover, I needed a little more clearance, so I just took this screw out of the AC hose bracket, and that'll give you enough room to just kind of pull it up and out. There we go. Now before we completely remove that bottom timing belt cover, we're going to actually keep it on, put the pulley back on, and put that bolt back in, because we need that arrow to help ensure that everything in the engine is lined up via what's called top dead center. We've got a 19mm socket and a very long extension on there, and what we're going to do is we're going to turn this pulley clockwise until we get all our notches lined up. Let's start turning that pulley. Right now you can see there's number 6 at the top. We need to get number 1 at the top. And you can see there's a little notch in that tooth right there, and we're going to perfectly line that up with the other notch. So you can see this first one's lined up. We got the number 1, that little notch on the tooth, and the line all lined up. Let's come over here, and kind of hard to see, but you can see that little line there matches up with the notch there. There we go. You got that little notch right there, and that line perfectly lined up. Now if we look at the bottom one, kind of hard to see, but you can actually see my little dot is maybe 1/4 inch to the right of that arrow. So I need to bring that back over just a tiny bit. Right there. Perfect. And that's lined up. And that one's lined up. So perfect. We are at top dead center. To get to these bottom bolts, you'll need to remove the crankshaft pulley. Make sure not to lose the key, and then you have access to the rest of some of these bolts on the bottom. Now what we'll do is we're going to take a painter's pen, and we're going to mark exactly where that tooth is on the old timing belt. Just a generic painter's pen I got from my local supermarket, Meyer. There we go. And just to help differentiate, I'm just going to put 2 dots on it like that. Let's come over here and do the same thing. I'm just going to kind of put a line on it. There we go. I'll finish that off camera. And then we're going to come under the car, and same thing. It doesn't have to be anywhere specific, but we're just going to make a mark on there somewhere. Let's see here. Remove that. I'm just removing this ring. And I'm going to make a mark right there. Perfect. So before we can actually remove the belt, we actually have 2 more parts we got to remove. That being the bracket holder, as well as the side engine mount. And furthermore, to get the side engine mount, we got to remove the cruise control module, simply held in by a couple bolts. We can disconnect this orange connector, kind of disconnect that clip there, take this black clip off, and there's one more orange clip back here. Push up on this tab, pull it out. It's on there pretty good. Might take a little bit to remove that, but once that's all said and done, we can lift our cruise control module up and out of the way to get access to that last bolt right down there. There's also one metal line attached to the bottom of the mount right down there. We got to kind of pop that out. There we go. Now we can remove the mount. It's kind of like a little puzzle, as it's pretty tight in there, so we're going to rotate to the right and then kind of flip it upside down. And bring it up through the top. Try to. Oh, there we go. And out it comes. Now we can remove that side bracket holder held in by 3 bolts. There's one down there, as well as one right here and one right there. Kind of hard to see. And we actually have to remove one more thing, that being the power steering pump, simply held in by those 2 mounting bolts on each side. So that way we can get access to one more hidden little bolt on top right down there. And then we can remove the bracket holder. We finally have access to this idler pulley right down there. And we just need to remove the pulley, so that way we can get the belt off. Keep note of the position it makes. It kind of makes like a Y shape in a way. So let's take that out. And I'll do that off camera. Now we're going to remove the tensioner, and if you're replacing it like I am, the tensioner pulley. Tensioner is held in by these 2 bolts right there, and the pulley, I believe, is held in by this one big bolt right there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to line up the old marks with the new one. We need to make sure that these teeth are perfectly aligned like this, and we'll copy some marks down, and we're going to keep these teeth aligned all the way around until eventually it meets up with our new mark. It's there. Just like that. You can see these 2 are lined up. And then we'll do the same thing for that last one. Just keep these teeth lined up. There we go. And last but not least, those 2 were also perfectly lined up. So there's only one thing left to remove, that being the water pump. You can kind of tell that it's right here by this black spindle. But before we remove that water pump, we're going to drain out the coolant of the radiator and the engine block. So we'll come under the passenger side of the front bumper here. Come under the car. You'll see a rectangular cutout here. And you'll see that white butterfly. We're going to loosen that a little bit until the coolant starts draining and let that drain into a drain pan. If that butterfly is difficult to remove, you can use a large 7/8 inch wrench to loosen that butterfly. You might have also noticed that with no side engine mount that I also took my jack out from under the car. That is perfectly fine. The whole point of putting the jack under there in the first place is to just support the engine to make removing that bolt a little bit easier. So we got that coolant draining in the drain pan, and to help speed it up, we're also going to remove the radiator cap. While that's draining, we can remove the reservoir, so we'll just unscrew the cap, set that to the side. We'll undo the negative battery terminal cable from the reservoir, and then we'll just lift it up and out. And we'll drain this coolant. You can see there's a bit of dirt and grit buildup at the bottom of the reservoir. We're just going to clean this out with some water. And then we can push that reservoir back in and reconnect the little negative cable. Now we're going to prepare to drain the engine block, and we're going to come up under the wheel well here. And there it is. Whoop. There it is. We'll put our 1/4-inch inner diameter tubing on that. It's going to be all by feel. This is going to be your view as you're doing it. And you're also going to need to get your wrench on there, all by feel. And when all is said and done, your setup should kind of look like that. Got your 12mm on there ready to go. Got the tube on there ready to go. And looks like we have halted to a drip. So we're going to tighten up that butterfly and get to the engine block. Awesome, that coolant is draining. I'll let that sit for a couple minutes until it's done, and we'll tighten up that drain valve. And now we're going to remove the water pump. So it's held in by about 6 or 8 bolts. There's 3 right there you can see. And 1, 2 more up there. We'll just remove all those bolts, and then we're going to prepare for coolant to spill out, because even though we drained the radiator and the engine block, there's still going to be more that's going to pool out from the pump itself. So put some cardboard down, try and get your pan as centered as possible, and then we'll remove that part. I've just got a lawn breaker bar here and a hammer, and I'm just going to smack it. Really close. I got it loose. You can see it's kind of leaking coolant. Maybe not so much see it from your angle, but there we are. And I'm gonna get another tool. Let's try this guy. About a flathead screwdriver. Get that in the crack. There we go. Hey, that's one way to do it. All right, water pump is out. We're just going to do our best to clean off that mating surface for the new O-ring. We'll put the new water pump in and torque those 5 bolts to about 8.5 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to work on putting the timing belt tensioner back on, but first we're going to remove this sleeve from the old one and transfer it to the new one. Torque that bolt to 19 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to reinstall the idler pulley with the bolt backed off about 5 or 6 revolutions, so that way it's nice and loose. It's time to reinstall that timing belt, but before we do that, we just need to double check that everything is still in time. There's our notch and the line. Kind of hard to see, but there's the notch and the line. That one's good. And coming onto the car, it's kind of hard to see on camera, but there's the notch and there's the arrow pointing down. So everything is in time. We can put that timing belt back on now. We're going to start from the bottom here at the crank, and we're going to work our way around counterclockwise, following that chart. So first we'll line up our mark with that on the crank here, and then we're going to loosely wrap it around the idler pulley and the tensioner pulley if we can. There we go. And then get a little snug right there. Now we're going to make our way to the top of the vehicle, snug it up like that, and we're going to wrap it around just like that. See, our white mark is lined up with the mark on the engine there. Next, we'll take that slack and we're going to guide it under the water pump pulley right down there. Next, we're going to take that slack and we're going to try and push it up through the engine bay towards that rear camshaft. So for this last camshaft pulley, it might be a little difficult to wrap it around. So what you can do is you can actually take your ratchet and bring the camshaft forward by turning it clockwise, and then you can kind of line it up that way. It might pop forward, that's okay. You can always turn it backwards, counterclockwise. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to line that line up right there with our white line, and then we'll put it back to top dead center. So I've got it wrapped around that rear camshaft. I got it on the top dead center mark on the actual camshaft itself. However, you'll notice it's still not perfectly lined up yet. But then what we'll do is we'll wrap it around the tensioner down there. And lastly, we're going to put our ratchet back on, and we're going to line top dead center. Perfect, we got that on. We are just going to triple check our top dead centers. Make sure that the mark on the camshaft, the timing belt, and the engine are all lined up, so that one's looking good. You got our top dead center mark, the line, and the engine all lined up. Coming under here, we got our 2 lines marked up, as well as top dead center. That's looking good. So now we can tighten that idler pulley bolt. Now we can torque the idler pulley bolt to 33 foot-pounds. We can put the tensioner back on and torque those 2 bolts to 8.5 foot-pounds. We can next pull the retainer pin or the grenade pin. To get this pin off, what I did is I took a screwdriver, put it up against the tensioner, then took my locking pliers, locked it right against the screwdriver, and I basically pried it apart. I twisted the screwdriver, that pushed the locking pliers back, and it pulled the pin out. Doing that 2 or 3 times will get it out all the way. Now we can start putting all those other components back together. We're going to start with that side engine bracket mount holder, and I find it's a lot easier to bring it through the bottom actually. Sometimes you forget that you can work from both angles. And I think I tried pulling it through the top last time. That was pretty hard. So this fits over that water pump spindle right there. Then we can torque those side bolts down to 33 foot-pounds. And then we can put that little 10mm bolt on top of that mount in and torque it down to 8.5 foot-pounds. Then we'll reattach the power steering pump. We'll put the nut down there on, as well as the nut on the back on right there. We're not going to torque them down yet. That'll come after we put the belt on. So before I put that side mount back in, I think instead I'm going to put the timing belt covers back on first, just to give myself a little bit more working room. You got to start by putting the bottom one on first, and then you can put the top 2 on after that. You don't need to torque these bolts down, just snug them down. Don't forget to put the timing belt guide plate back on. The flat surface goes down and the bump's towards you. Next we're going to put that serpentine belt tensioner back in, and we're going to torque these 3 bolts to 8.5 foot-pounds. Now we're going to get ready to put this oil dipstick tube back in, but first we're going to replace this little O-ring here. So I've got my pick tool. I'm just going to take it off like that. Okay. And then we'll put the new one on. Perfect. Then we can take our dipstick tube and slide it back on in. There it goes. And then we can install that little 10mm bolt up there again. Next we'll reinstall the crankshaft pulley, and we're going to get our bolt ready to be put back in. We just need to coat the threads and the outside surface of the washer. Then we can put the bolt back in. Next we got to get out our crankshaft pulley holder, so that way the crankshaft doesn't spin as we torque it down. And then I've got my ratchet just kind of wedged in between a couple parts of the suspension to help hold it in place. And now we're going to torque that bolt down to 181 foot-pounds. Now we're going to work on installing the power steering belt. So we got to start it behind the crankshaft pulley first at the bottom. Then we'll come up on top and fish our belt the rest of the way through. And try and slide it on over this other pulley here. We need to tighten our power steering pump belt. So as you saw, it's still loose. So what we need to do is we need to tighten the tensioner until we get about a 1/2 inch of flexion. So right now you can see we've got like a solid inch or two. And we need it so it's pretty tight and only flexes like a 1/2 inch. So what you'll do now is you'll push up against it and you'll just feel it pretty much stop. You don't need to force it, but that's as far as I can push it with reasonable force. That's roughly a 1/2 inch. So I would call that good. Now we're just gonna tighten those 2 locking nuts. There's one down there, and then again the one in the back. We're gonna tighten those to 17 foot-pounds. I think while everything's just still apart and there's a lot of room to work around here, I'm gonna install the accessory belt next. So first we're gonna start it on the alternator here. And now we're just gonna guide the belt on the outside of this bottom right pulley here, as well as on the outside of our crankshaft pulley. And then lastly, we're gonna take that belt, bring it down, and wrap it around the tensioner pulley. And to do that, we're gonna come back on top of the car. We're gonna take our Serpentine belt tensioner tool, and we're gonna release the tension by pushing forward. And then we will guide that belt under the tensioner pulley. And we're just gonna ensure that the belt is properly wrapped around all the other pulleys as well. It's a little loose on the crankshaft pulley there. Everything looks good. We can release the tension. And our accessory belt is installed. Perfect. After putting those 2 belts in, we can work on putting the rest of the components over here in. We're going to start by putting that mount in and loosely installing those 3 bolts. And I might recommend starting with that back bolt there just because it's hardest to get to. Next, we're going to loosely install the bracket, and then we're also going to loosely install the side bracket to mount bolt, and then we're going to torque the 3 mount bolts to 40 foot-pounds. Now we can torque the bracket bolts down to 33 foot-pounds. And then lastly, we can torque that bracket to mount bolt to 40 foot-pounds. Don't forget to install that little bracket on the mount bracket and install the alternator cable. And then we can install the cruise control module. We connect those 3 clips, tighten down the 3 bolts, install that little tube up there. Next we can install the splash shield as well as the clip right up there. And there's one more up in here too. And then you can put the splash guard and the wheel well lining on. Get all those clips all the way around and under. Then we can put our wheel on, torque those lug nuts. We can put these 2 covers back on, and now it's time to fill up the coolant. We got our Type 2 coolant there from Honda, and we're going to start by filling this up to the base of the filler neck. You can fit about 1 1/4 gallons in there to start, so a whole gallon like that, and then maybe a quarter of those until you get to the top of the filler neck. Then we're going to loosely install our cap. We're going to get in the car and start the car for 30 seconds and turn it off. And before you start the car for the first time, don't forget to keep the heat and fans to the max. Okay, this will be the first startup since installing that timing belt, so let's cross our fingers. Here we go. Awesome, she purrs like a kitten. Everything's working good. And now we're gonna fill the radiator again all the way up to the base of that filler neck. And we're also going to top off the reservoir down there and bring it up to that max fill line. And we're going to put the cap back on there, put the radiator cap back on as well. And for our next step, we're going to start the car again. And the goal this time is to bring the car up to full operating temperature. And the goal is to also get the fans to kick on twice. And so what you can do to accelerate this process is bring the car up to 1500 RPMs until the fans kick on, and then let off the gas until the fans turn off. And then you can bring the engine up to 1500 RPMs again until those fans kick on and you can turn the car off. So I actually have to admit I couldn't get my radiator fans to turn on for whatever reason. I guess it's just too cold of a day to get the engine hot enough at idle. But nonetheless, we got the car up to full operating temperature, nice and hot. I think that's the goal. And now what we're going to do is we're going to let the engine cool for about an hour, and then we're going to top off the radiator and the reservoir one more time. You never want to open this when it's hot, so a good way to know if your engine's cool enough is if you can hold on to this without hurting yourself. It's pretty hot at the moment. And also you should be able to squeeze this pretty much flat. Right now, I can only squeeze it about halfway. So yeah, let's let it cool for an hour and come back. In the meantime, what we can do, since we just ran the car for about 5 minutes, is we can double check the tension of our power steering belt. So let's give that a check. Good, still at about 3/8 to 1/2 inch. Exactly where we want it. So perfect, that doesn't need readjusting. So it's been about an hour, and let's see how hot the tube is. Still warm, but I can hold on to it. And you'll also notice that now I can squish it all the way flat, which is what you want to see. So that means it is safe to remove the cap. We're still going to remove it slowly just in case. There we go. All right. And then one last time, we're just going to top off the radiator fill neck there, as well as if the coolant in your reservoir went down, we'll top that off to the max fill line down there as well. And we should be all finished with the coolant process. And there you have it, everybody. We are all finished changing our timing belt. Not a very difficult job, but a lengthy one nonetheless. A lot of parts to remove, not a lot of space to work in, but we got it done nonetheless. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. It helps me out a lot. I'll also be posting some links to some other videos that you guys might find helpful, such as an in-depth how to change your engine mounts video, as well as a how to change your coolant video. I'll also be posting in the description more information, as well as part numbers, links to parts, torque specs, as well as timestamps to better navigate through the video in case you need to go back and check anything. Feel free to leave a comment, ask any questions. I'm really good at getting back to people. And always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and take care.